Hello, historians. Today we are doing notes 4 from Unit 6, Peace, Love, and Unrest. After John F. Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon Johnson took office. He was able to continue Kennedy's work with the civil rights movement and other social reforms that he called the Great Society. In this way, he worked to expand civil rights to more Americans. However, many Americans became frustrated with Johnson over his commitment to U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia, mainly the Vietnam War. The year before Johnson took office, the U.S. had 11,000 troops and military advisors in Vietnam. That was under Kennedy. In 1963, Johnson committed more military support to South Vietnam. In 1965, he had sent 180,000 American troops, and by 1968, there were 500,000 U.S. military troops, most of them drafted, fighting in Vietnam. And this was fighting a war in Vietnam that Congress had never voted to formally declare war on North Vietnam or the Viet Cong or Ho Chi Minh or any of that. So this is going to frustrate some Americans. So in your notes, would you please write down that Lyndon B. Johnson expanded civil rights to minorities and increased U.S. military presence in Vietnam. As the Vietnam War dragged on, more and more Americans, especially the young adults of the baby boom generation, became less and less supportive of the war. As their family, friends, classmates, and neighbors were fighting and often dying in this war, young people who remained behind began to question President Johnson's commitment to the war, especially after seeing so much of the war through their television sets. Anti-war protests began to spread across the country. When Johnson decided not to run for re-election, Richard Nixon campaigned with promises to bring American troops home from Vietnam. Nixon did bring troops home in 1973, but only after the war had expanded into Laos and Cambodia. Some Americans were embarrassed at the lack of support for American soldiers in Vietnam. Many Americans felt that communism was a continued threat to society and the world. They still believed in containment and the domino theory of if Vietnam falls to communism, then all the neighboring countries will as well, and it will just spread to more places on the planet. Many Americans wanted to continue until we had a victory. These people were nicknamed hawks after predatory birds. We talked about war hawks back in the War of 1912 when we studied that era. Way back, we talked about how Britain had been impressing and capturing U.S. soldiers, forcing them to serve in the British Navy, and we talked about how they had been how about both Britain and France had been interfering with U.S. shipping for many years, and there were some Americans who were fed up by it and wanted us to take some military action, so they were nicknamed war hawks. In this situation, we have Americans who felt that we needed to continue to prevent the spread of communism in the world, and so they were nicknamed hawks. The increasing number of Americans who did not support the war and who were calling for peace were nicknamed doves after the bird that has long symbolized peace. Some Americans felt caught in between, not supporting the war itself, but wanting to at least give support to their sons, their brothers, their husbands, their friends, their classmates, their family members who were serving or had served. So for doves, you're going to write down felt that the U.S. should end fighting in Vietnam. Peace. More than 58,000 Americans died fighting the Vietnam War. Hundreds of thousands more came home wounded, disabled, and suffering from emotional and mental health problems such as post-traumatic stress disorder. Still, roughly 1,300 U.S. soldiers had been captured and classified as prisoners of war, held captive in terrifying prison camps where they were often tortured. Another 1,200 troops were listed as missing in action, and their fates were never known. So please write down in your notes, 1,300 U.S. soldiers were listed as prisoners of war, 1,200 listed as missing in action during the Vietnam War. Some of the POWs were later released by the Vietnamese. One of them was U.S. Senator from Arizona and 2000 presidential candidate John McCain. When he was a captain in the Navy, he had been captured in 1967 and was a prisoner of war for 5 years, during which he was beaten and tortured into confessing to war crimes. He was released in 1973. The youth of America were increasingly challenging the government over the war that they felt was unnecessary. College-age Americans began to speak out vigorously. Many college campuses held anti-war demonstrations, which took many forms. Marches, rallies, and teach-ins took place as students questioned the government's version of what was happening in Vietnam. The distrust of the government grew even greater after the tragedy at Kent State University in Ohio, May of 1970. 4 people were shot and killed when the National Guard was called in to respond to anti-war demonstrations that were taking place on the campus. Citizens had gathered to protest the expansion of Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. President Nixon blamed the protesters after the event, saying, "This is what happens when dissent turns to violence and it invites tragedy." Okay, so please write down in your notes for Kent State that this is where 4 students died when the National Guard opened fire on a crowd of Vietnam War protesters in May of 1970. There's a video that I showed in class about this. I will post the link on our Google Classroom, so you can take a look and listen to some of the people who were actually there, some primary sources and their accounts of what happened at Kent State. The baby boom generation had reached young adulthood. At this point, they had become idealistic in the 1960s, and many began to openly challenge society and people in authority. They sought to end injustice and rejected traditional values. Okay. Many young adults and youth began calling themselves hippies. They rejected cultural trends of pursuing money and consumer goods. They embraced values that seemed opposite of America's middle-class suburban life. They wanted to start an era of peace and love and freedom, and they grew their hair long. Some moved to communes where they would farm and share everything together. Their rejection of modern culture made their movement what we call a counterculture, a subculture in a set society that goes against the normal cultural trends. So please write down in your notes that hippies openly challenged authority and society's values. They created communes where groups worked together and shared everything. We'll talk more about them in the activity when we do our 1968 time warp. Beyond protesting the government's expansion of Vietnam, many youth were protesting the way that the government was drafting young men to serve in the military. Boys were required by law to register for the draft, and when they turned 18, usually in high school, their high school counselor called them down and they filled out the paperwork. That's what happened to my father in 1973 when he was in high school, a senior in high school, and turned 18. If their draft number was chosen, they were forced to report for military training and sent to fight in a war that many of them at this point did not even support. Many young men resisted the draft. In the photograph here, you see these men are burning their draft cards. Many did what we call draft dodging, or dodging the draft by fleeing to Canada. Those people were not allowed back in the United States until later on, the president pardons them and allows them to come back. A movement began to amend the Constitution and change the voting age from 21 down to 18. If they were going to have to fight a country's wars, they should at least have a voice in choosing the country's leaders, is what they felt. In March of 1971, a proposal for a constitutional amendment was submitted, and it was ratified July 1st of that same year, and that legally changed the voting age to 18. Okay, this was the fastest amendment to ever be ratified. So apparently it got a lot of support. It kind of made sense, if you ask me. If you're old enough to be armed and trained to fight for your country, you should at least be considered old enough to help make the decision of who runs the country. In the 1970s, the oldest of the baby boomers were beginning to settle down and starting to raise families. Nixon began reducing the number of troops in Vietnam, and the U.S. Ended involvement in Vietnam in 1973. The counterculture began to kind of quiet down a little bit. However, the distrust of the government, specifically the executive branch, the presidency, lingered. The distrust and unrest grew even greater when Richard Nixon's re-election campaign was caught breaking into the Watergate Hotel, where the Democratic Party had its headquarters. When an investigation took place, Nixon tried to cover up the incident. He lied about his campaign's involvement. This gets him into even more hot water. In 1973, a Senate committee learned that Nixon had tape-recorded conversations in the Oval Office. People began to call for impeachment for Nixon, but instead he resigned from office. Okay, his famous line, "I am not a crook." Please write down for Richard Nixon that he ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam, but he also resigned because of the Watergate scandal. And the Watergate scandal is when Nixon's reelection campaign was caught breaking in to the Democratic Party headquarters. It's a lot more complicated than this, but you just need to know that they were caught breaking in. He lied about it. He almost was impeached, but he resigned instead. President Ford, when Nixon resigned, his vice president, Gerald Ford, took the oath of office and became president. And he promptly, as the president has the power to do, he basically said that, he's pardoned and he doesn't have to face any legal action or serve any sort of punishment. There's a video that I can link up on our Google Classroom. You can watch on your own time. Another issue captured Americans' attentions in the 1970s and created more unrest. People relied heavily on petroleum and gasoline resources to fuel their cars and heat their homes. Most of America's oil was imported from countries in the Middle East who were members of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. In 1973, the nation of Israel was invaded by some of the countries in OPEC, and the United States gave support to Israel in the Arab-Israeli War. In response, OPEC suppliers cut production and reduced the amount of oil exported to the United States. This resulted in an oil shortage. Suddenly, Americans were experiencing this energy crisis. Gas shortages forced drivers to spend hours waiting in lines at gas stations, and homeowners worried about rising fuel costs. Americans were weary, and they were tired of this all, and they were ready for political change. Okay. No gas pumps closed. So please write down that oil exporting countries cut supplies to the U.S. for supporting Israel, creating an energy crisis. Okay, that's it for today. You should have all of this filled in pretty much. It should look pretty much like this. Okay. Have a great day.